Alright, my loyal specs, let's go back to a topic that I've been kinda staying away from for a while because there's really no new information to use about it, and I kinda wanted to stay away from just more baseless speculation and guessing. Little Nightmares. I've had the opportunity to really just play through the game a few times and have a good think on a lot of what the game talks about. I've talked at length in a live stream or somewhere about how I think using the 7 deadly sins to analyze something is the laziest and most overused overlay through which someone can theorize about a thing, and that literally everything is easily fittable into that mold. It's just lazy, and even if the creators intended for a thing to be the 7 deadly sins, that's also pretty lazy these days. You have to be pretty creative for it to not be just straight up bad. With that said, what I'm about to talk about may seem similar in nature, but I want you to look critically at this and think about it. It's definitely not the 7 deadly sins thing. There's a possibility that Little Nightmares is an allegory to the 5 stages of grief. Let's look at them now and see where they fit in. For this theory to work, we have to consider the world of Little Nightmares to be allegorical and not literal, which is something I've not done in a theory for this game yet. So give me a chance and I'll see what I can't do to convince you. The first stage of grief is denial. In this stage, the person involved with whatever tragedy they've experienced vehemently refuses to believe that it's happened, or that it's as bad as it really is. Often, a child will pretend that the thing didn't happen, or just simply not understand it. At the beginning of the game, Six lives in a suitcase. The suitcase is important here because perhaps Six heard someone say the phrase, living out of a suitcase, and took it literally in her brain, because she'd had to pack up a bunch of things she'd need when she was made to leave her house where she was living. Well, why was she made to pack up and leave? Well, only a few rooms over, the Hanged Man rests in silence. This is the event that starts the grief cycle. Her father or guardian or giant big brother or some other such thing dies, in one way or another. Thanks to the way that children see the world, the only version that we get is this distorted, elongated, identity-obscured kind of thing going on. Many people point out that the way the hangman is set up could not be a suicide, because the chair is A, not tall enough to have been the thing he was standing on, and B, not tipped over. But this could explain that set of discrepancies. It's an imperfect recollection from Six's memory of the way she saw it. Nevertheless, we see Six wake up and move with purpose, largely ignoring the hanging man in his letter. This is her denial stage, that this sort of thing is normal and no one's hurt and everything's fine. The second stage of grief is anger, where frequent outbursts of emotion are common, and the griever often blames the person who was lost, or themselves, or perhaps another person, for the tragedy. In a child's case, the anger is often accompanied by a refusal to acknowledge or understand the reasons behind a tragedy, and the breaking of objects. This comes into play almost immediately in the game when you run into the doll jars that, when broken, release some kind of mist or spirit. These dolls have a resemblance to the lady, and they are literally meant to be broken in the game, to the point where you get an achievement when you break all of them. This could show that Six comes to blame the lady as the reason that her father is now gone, and takes her anger out on the dolls that look like her. This actually continues through the entire game. The third stage of grief is bargaining, where the sufferer tries to regain control, using a lot of if-only kind of words and trying to make some kind of deal with themselves, or with the person they lost, or with others related to that position, or even some kind of deity figure. This is a little bit of a stretch, but it could be represented by her interaction with the janitor and the chefs. The janitor may represent some kind like a caretaker that Six spent her time with. Perhaps a daycare attendant or a nanny of sorts? Maybe her reasoning here is, if only the janitor hadn't kept me from seeing my father more. The chefs may be a representation of the overindulgence her father obviously has a problem with, but since Six has no concept of alcohol and drugs and that kind of thing, she takes it simply as drinking and eating part and parcel. These chefs are the idea that if only father hadn't stuffed himself with so much of the things that he liked to do so often. We see evidence of this actually, with the amount of cigarettes that we find in the room, with the amount of empty bottles that are around also as well. The fourth stage of grief is depression. This is the overwhelming realization that everything is real, the worrying about the practical and private concerns that the loss entails, and the desire to just be separated from the whole thing. In the game, the guests appear to exist as a representation of this depression, obstacles that Six has to constantly keep one step ahead of, or else. They show up in the game and take up space, making a lot of the areas that Six has to traverse much more difficult, and causing distress to the point where Six has a full mental breakdown and has to flee from the situation completely. This, of course, is the segment of the game where she has to run from the oncoming horde of guests, and make a leap into the wide open, where she could very well miss the lantern and fall to her own death. The fifth stage is acceptance, where one makes peace with the fact that the tragedy has happened. In children, this often shows up as a period of sort of silence and withdrawal, but in a calm sense. Not happy, not sad, just accepting. It often takes a child coming to terms with something through an act or explanation of some kind. Attending a funeral, having the idea of death explained to them, giving them a reason for what's happened. In Six's case, it's her fight with the lady and subsequent trip to the top of the maw that represents this stage. Six seems to know that the lady had something to do with her father's death, as evidenced by the destruction of the statues that resemble her. Therefore, taking this symbolic revenge on the lady, who in this version of the allegory may be like a mistress rather than a wife, which is what caused her father to kill himself from guilt, perhaps, is her way of coping with the fact that she blames the lady for the death of her father. This event leads to her ability to transcend the depression she was facing in the form of absorbing the life energy from the guests, and to reach a state of calm where she can sit in silence and solitude on the tiny island top of the maw. Now, a lot of people will point out, oh, but Vincent, doesn't she escape from the maw at this point? And to that I say, no, she doesn't. There's no way off the top of that island. There's no boat nearby. All that she gets out of going to the top of there is some peace and quiet, some solitude, a place that she can sit and be alone for a while with her own thoughts. In this allegory, Six is taking responsibility for the death of her father by dealing with the thing that she thinks caused it. I think it's a coming-of-age story. Maybe not the best coming-of-age story, maybe not a story that really exemplifies how someone had ought to come of age, but it does exemplify these things. The entire idea of the story being about loss and the ways to cope with it definitely makes sense. Well, but Vincent, then how do you rationalize the DLC? How do you rationalize the depths? Well, that's from a different character's perspective. It may be set in the same world, but it's from the perspective of the runaway kid. And because we know that he's called Runaway, we can make some assumptions about what he's running away from. Could it possibly be that the runaway kid's coping mechanism is that he's simply trying to escape from everything and not have to deal with it anymore? What tragedy did he experience? Because I vehemently will put my foot down and stand on the soapbox that the runaway kid and Six are not related until we find some concrete evidence otherwise. Well, anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed this theory. It's been a while since we've come back to Little Nightmares because there hasn't been anything new about it, but the DLC is coming out again in November, so watch for that happening. As soon as that comes out, you better believe I'll be right on top of it. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this theory, and I hope that it's maybe opened a couple more genres of conversation that you could have about the game. If you would like to support me in any way, there are a couple ways that you could do it, the first of which is to like, subscribe, comment, hit all of the buttons on this video, except for the downvote button, I suppose. You can also follow my social media, that's the Facebook and Twitter that are in the description box. You can click some of the boxes that are on screen right now so that you can get to some of my other videos, and if you want to keep me not dead and not starving to death, you can throw some support my direction at the Patreon link that's there as well. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.